It's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for tonight, Major General David Blackledge. He was commissioned in June of 1975 upon his graduation from the United States Military Academy. And while on active duty, he served with the 3rd Armored Division in Germany and the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He transferred to the Army Reserve in 1981, joining the 84th Training Division in Wisconsin. From 1988 to 1994, he was here in Columbia as a member of the 360th Civil Affairs Brigade in Fort Jackson. He deployed to Iraq for Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1991. In 1994 to Haiti for Operation Uphold Democracy, where he served as a ministerial advisor to the newly established Haitian government. In 1994, he assumed command of the 426th Civil Affairs Brigade in Upland, California, and deployed to Bosnia in 1997. As you can see, General Blackledge, like most reservists today, has had a career of not just a civilian life, but also a military life as well. Additional active duty assignments included duty as the Civil Military Advisor for the Office of Military Cooperation, United States Embassy, Kuwait, 2000 and 2001. Chief of the Civil Military Operation Division Plans and Policy Directorate, J5, U.S. Central Command, from 2001-2000, that was Operation Enduring Freedom. He assumed command of the 354th Civil Affairs Brigade, Riverdale, Maryland in 2002, deployed back to Kuwait in 2003, subsequently into Iraq on Operation Iraqi Freedom. In 2007, he became the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Mobilization and Reserve Affairs, G3, G5, G7 at Headquarters, Department of the Army in Washington, D.C. Major General Blackledge assumed command of the U.S. Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command Airborne on the 20th of September, 2009. His decorations include 2 Legions of Merit, 5 Bronze Star Medals, 2 Purple Hearts, 3 Defense Meritorious Service Medals, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, 3 Army Commendation Medals, 1 for Valor, 2 Joint Service Achievement Medals, and the Army Achievement Medal. General Blackledge, as a former member of the 360 Civil Affairs Brigade, it is a pleasure to welcome you back to Jackson.
But I think it's a topic that deserves much attention. It's consumed particularly the Army and the Marine Corps' time and efforts for the last 10 years, and untold national treasure and lives. So it's something that we've unfortunately relearned the hard way and gotten darn good at it now with lots of practice. But I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Insurgencies have been, are, and will be the predominant form of warfare in the world. Purely conventional warfare, which has been our preferred way of war in the United States for some time, requires conventional armies on both sides of the conflict that are confident enough in their capabilities and willingly and openly engage in force-on-force confrontations. You can think of Desert Storm or even Panama. Unfortunately, this type of warfare is the exception, not the rule. At this point in history, the United States has no real peer competitor, and that will force our enemies to use irregular tactics against us. A key aspect of these tactics will be wars among the people, where the enemy can use the larger populace to hide them and sustain them. Additionally, over half of the world's nation-states are weak, failing, or failed, which makes them prime locations for insurgencies to unfold or be fostered by outside entities. We can use our experience in Iraq as an example of how a conventional conflict that was quickly won in a matter of weeks still turned into a protracted insurgency that we are still fighting today, 9 years later, at far greater cost in lives and national treasure than we expended during the initial conventional phase. I believe it will be helpful to review how we got into the messy counterinsurgencies we're in. We've been conducting counterinsurgency warfare for a decade now, and it is often easy to forget that we didn't initially intend to fight insurgencies. We actually intended quite the opposite. Struggle with my computer here. So how did this come about? It was a result of numerous blunders by both our civilian leadership and our military who had conveniently forgotten the lessons of Vietnam, largely because we were determined never to fight that type of war again. Instead, we focused on developing the most capable conventional force on the planet so we could dominate in the type of wars we wanted to fight. As a result, we initially won the war in Iraq in 2003, but then quickly lost the peace. And boy, did we lose the peace in spectacular fashion. Through numerous decisions, both before the war started and after the conventional battle was over, we literally created the insurgency we've been fighting ever since. And let me pause for a minute just to emphasize that these opinions are my own, and I'm not necessarily speaking for the Department of Defense. I was on the invasion force and was there for 14 months to watch all this unfold, and it was quite disheartening to watch the golden moment that we had quickly slip out of our fingers. So let me talk about some of the blunders that were made. On the policy side, there were unrealistic assumptions that after the fall of Saddam's regime, the Iraqi people would rise up, take the initiative, and continue running the country. When I say run the country, I don't mean at the senior political level. We assumed that everyday bureaucrats, technical administrators, police, judges, fire departments, medical specialists, and teachers would keep essential services running. We expected initiative within a society that had painfully learned not to take the initiative for 30 years under the Saddam regime. We assumed that the military would be greeted as liberators and could quickly leave after toppling the regime without ever being seen or having to function as occupiers. We haphazardly threw together a supposed interagency team to help advise the Iraqis on the formation of a constitutional and democratic form of government. This team was called the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, or ORHA. It was led by Lieutenant General retired Jay Garner. However, it was established too late to form a comprehensive interagency team. They had less than 90 days to form and get the country to start performing. They were insufficiently resourced by all the interagency players in general skills, but also by a woeful lack of Arabists who understood the language and culture they'd be working in. They were not given clear linkage to the military, limiting their ability to synchronize their efforts with the overall military effort, nor was the military instructed on how to deal with ORHA. Despite these severe disadvantages, the ORHA team did a Herculean effort, and they did make some progress in establishing an interim Iraqi leadership team composed of Iraqis, and reestablishing the government ministries, vetting organizations to eliminate hardcore Baathists, paying employees, and reassuring the Iraqi regular army that it would be reconstituted and used for internal security. But then we did another blunder. We replaced Jay Garner with Jerry Bremer, changing the organization's name to the Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, but more critically, changing the focus from enabling the Iraqis to firmly establish, to firmly establishing the coalition as in control and making it clear that we would be the occupying force for some time. Reinforcing that intent, Jerry Bremer then announced key policy decisions within a matter of days of getting on the ground that reversed much of what had been accomplished thus far. So we were making progress, we did the transition, and which is always disruptive, but rather than continuing the efforts of the previous organization, we totally reversed policy and destroyed the efforts that had already been done. The key decisions, policy decisions that Jerry Bremer made were that he disbanded the Iraqi army. This had not been pre-briefed to the National Security Council, who were quite surprised when he announced to them that he was doing this. It was totally opposite of the advice that he was being given by the military leadership that were on the ground, as well as Jay Garner from Warnock. What was worse is that there was a total lack of understanding of the campaign, the psychological operations campaign that we had worked prior to and during combat operations, and then had been working under ORHA. And that was that we had told the Iraqi army, the regular army, we knew that we couldn't reach the Republican army, that they'd have to go, as well as the Fedayeen. But we had told the Iraqi army that if you don't fight us, then we will take care of you. We'll take care of your family. We're going to rebuild the country. And many of them, most of them, did exactly that. They made token efforts at fighting, and then they withdrew and just kind of melted into the landscape and went back home. And frankly, and I was there working with senior leaders in the military, the Iraqi military at the time. They felt betrayed. They felt, we did what you asked, and now you've told us that we're all disbanded. And these are professional officers and NCOs that their life and means of making a living was as part of the Iraqi army. We told them, you're out of a job, go home, you're a defeated force. And now we've got thousands of well-trained military professionals with weapons and ammunition that we've just alienated. Not a wise decision. We had also told the Army that they would receive, we had told them they were going to receive their pay and benefits. In fact, we were working and my forces were working actively with the Iraqi Army to get them paid. And then suddenly with this decree by Jerry Bremer, they were told they would receive no pay or no benefits. Thus we left, and the intent of the military campaign, and why we had the PSYOP campaign directed towards them, was that we would reconstitute the Army. It would be smaller. We would get a lot of the conscripts, they'd go home. But the professional force, we would reconstitute them and use them for internal security within Iraq. Yeah, we just now told them that, okay, that plan is out. You're going home, no job. Jerry Bremer then announced that de-Baathification efforts would go deeper than the previous policy, and that the previous policy, there were different tiers of Baathists. Tier 1 were the highest level Baathists, and the previous policy were Tier 1 through 3 were to be, basically they'd lose their jobs and were no longer welcome in the government. However, Jerry Bremer decided to lower that cut line to Tier 4, again, against the recommendations of those that had been there and were there and had been working the issue and knew the Iraqi culture. The problem that entailed was that Tier 4 included the district managers, many of the teachers. All of the teachers had to belong to the Baathist Party to have their job. The party had very strong control of the education system because that was their way of inculcating new generations. But now you've just eliminated a large part of the education system. And what does that do? Now you've got students that no longer have classes to go to, and you have young people that are now don't have anything to do with their day, and except to get in trouble or cause trouble, as well as all the disaffected teachers. The district managers were predominantly technocrats. These were the key bureaucrats that knew how to run the operations, and everything was state-run. So these are the folks that knew how to run the electrical grid and the electrical system, the water treatment facilities, the medical system, and all the other functions that the government controlled. And they had risen in their organization because of their technical expertise, and basically they had to be Baptist to maintain their employment. And when they became district managers, they were given the status of Tier 4 in the Baptist Party. But they weren't, for the most part, they were not hardcore Baptists. And we've just now eliminated all the folks that are critical to running the government functions and the essential services. Additionally, we lost the initiative on the information campaign. We focused on engagement with Western media. You may all remember, or some of you may remember, we had embedded journalists with a lot of the Army units. My brigade had 2 embedded journalists. But these were all Western journalists. And then once we won the conventional battle, we continued the information campaign to the Western media, but ignored the Arab media, and particularly the Iraqi media. And so we lost that information campaign to the growing insurgency. We also were very slow, extremely slow in engaging tribal leaders. This is personally very frustrating for me because as a civil affairs brigade commander, we were reaching out to the tribal leaders. I had, as you heard from my resume, I had spent significant time working in that theater of operations before the war. I knew how important tribal affiliation was to the Iraqi people, as it was to the Kuwaiti people, the Jordanians, everyone in that region. The tribes, the devotion of individuals were first to their family, then to their tribe, then to their religion. And so you had tribes that had multiple religions in it, multiple ethnic groups in it. And to ignore the tribal system and the tribal leaders was an insult to the tribal leaders and their whole system of operating. One CPA official responded when I implored them that we needed to engage the tribal leadership, that the tribal system was so 18th century, and we need to bring the Iraqi society into the 21st century and just have to get rid of that whole tribal system. A total lack of understanding of the culture of not only Iraq but the region. And part of my comment response was, well, we still have tribes in the United States, so we've accommodated them. And of course, the tribes controlled large swaths of territory that crossed provincial boundaries, and they knew what was going on in their tribal area, and they controlled whether things happened or didn't happen within their tribal area. And many, if not most, were tacitly complicit with the growing insurgency. And we just gave them more and more reasons to support that and not support us by ignoring them. It was fully 8 months into the occupation before CPA finally realized that we really do need to start an active tribal engagement. Started that up, and it was led by one of my officers that agreed to stay on and work with CPA to do that. We had unsynchronized plans for restoring essential services and getting the economy running. CPA efforts were often in direct opposition to military efforts. CPA tended to look long-term, while the military focused on what was needed now to satisfy the needs of the people. Examples included restarting state-owned enterprises and plans for restoring the electrical grid. And this was an interesting development, and it would have been a great academic discussion point if it hadn't been so critical. But we, the military, needed to get people back to work. We needed to get the economy back up and running to employ people, to get them paid, so they would have no reason to join this insurgency because they could make a living and feed their families. The predominant system in Iraq they were state-owned enterprises. And one example was cement plants. They had quite a few cement plants in Iraq. Each plant employed thousands of people. But CPA's look at it was that we don't want them to have state-owned enterprises. We want this to be an open economy, and so we don't want to support and re-stand up state-owned enterprises. That's not the long-term view for Iraq. And the argument on the military side was, well, that's fine for a long-term view, but we got soldiers getting killed right now, the people that don't have work to do, and we need to get them work. We need to stand this back up. Another example was electricity, which was a big issue. The electrical grid was a disaster. It had all kinds of problems, lack of maintenance and lack of equipment. Not to mention what I talked about earlier with key managers being displaced. And CPA's view of how to fix the electrical grid, and I remember sitting in a meeting where they were going through these grandiose plans, and I said, okay, how long is this going to take to do what you're talking about? Oh, it'll take at least 2 years before we make a significant improvement in the electrical grid. And I go, 2 years? We don't have 2 years. We got to get electricity to the people now. And one example that I use is I said, rather than rebuilding these huge electrical plants, and one of the interesting phenomena that was happening was that the electrical substations and whatnot would be attacked during the night. I mean, people would just randomly shoot at them, throw explosives at them, and nobody could figure out, well, why are they doing this? This is their electricity we're trying to get them. Well, they were frustrated because they weren't getting electricity, or they were getting it sporadically. They could never know when they were going to have electricity or not. You can imagine, you're trying to make a meal for your family, and suddenly you lose electricity, and you get the frustrations that everyday people were feeling about this. So they would take their frustrations out on the electrical monolith and they saw it as a state-run industry that we, the coalition, now own. And so they were taking their anger out on the very means that we were trying to do to fix it. And one of the suggestions that I made was that what we need to do is we need to have the Iraqi people feel ownership for their own electricity. And I use the example of my own unit that had taken a large generator that powered the little area that we were occupying, and we rebuilt that generator, and we had a rotating schedule of who was maintaining that, refueling it. And we took very good care of that generator because it was our electric grid. So we need to do that at the local level so that the Iraqi people feel ownership for the generation of electricity for their neighborhood. And if we do that, they will make sure nothing happens to that electric grid. And they go, well, how can we do that? I said, we need generators. And they said, how many generators that would take? I mean, it would be countless. I said, well, I tell you what, we can get generators now, and we can get them here, and the Iraqis will take care of them, rather than wait 2 years for this big system to come online. What was interesting is 15 months after I left, I was back in Iraq, and we were still barely creeping along with the electrical grid, producing electricity. But if you flew over Baghdad, it was bright lights, because every Iraqi neighborhood and Iraqi that was well enough off had a generator. I mean, the generators were all over the place, but it took us 2 years of pain before they got to that point. They were still frustrated that we couldn't get the electrical grid running. We also made major military blunders. That included a conscious decision to give short shrift to Phase 4 planning of the campaign. Phase 4 planning is post-combat operations where the military consolidates the gains and secures the peace. I was down at CENTCOM during the initial phases of Operation Enduring Freedom and when we were planning the Iraq campaign. And I was very frustrated because we weren't doing enough Phase 4 planning. And General Franks finally, he told, and I was in the planning organization there at CENTCOM. He said, we will not do Phase 4 planning. I've been directed by the Secretary of Defense not to do that. There's an organization being formed up in Washington that's going to take care of all of that. All we have to focus on is winning the battle. And we're going to turn it over to this interagency organization with a lot of State Department people who are going to do it. And I'm thinking, okay, I've been to a lot of places in the world and I've done great work with the State Department and they're wonderful people, but they don't have the capacity to do what we think they're going to do. And if we think we're going to get there and turn it over to this interagency organization and just leave, we're woefully deluding ourselves. We also had a basic lack of understanding of the need for security within the population. An example was the initial failure to respond to the massive looting that was taking place. And the military's response was, that's not our job. We're here to defeat the Iraqi military. We're not here to police Baghdad and keep the looters from destroying the place. And this was a direct result of the confusion by the military of whether they were an occupying force or not. The responsibilities of an occupying force towards the society is clearly delineated in the laws of war. And I remember in Kuwait, before we went in, and then even as we were going in, massive discussions across military headquarters about what our responsibilities were. And the legal folks would emphasize, and the civil affairs folks would emphasize that, hey, as soon as we go in, we own the place. And we're responsible for taking care of the populace and meeting the essential needs. But many determined that, no, we're not going to be an occupying force, even though, in effect, we were. We're a liberating force. We're just here to free up the Iraqis, take out the regime, and let them stand up and take over things. It was, again, delusional thinking. It was wishful thinking. We also had difficulty figuring out the difference between a latent resistance by former regime loyalists and an active insurgency against the occupying forces. I mean, it was months that we were talking about, these are just regime hardliners that are attacking our forces and just refusing to give up. And I know in my case, in many of my civil affairs supporting units, who were talking to the tribal leaders and asking, hey, who are these people attacking us? And I remember one tribal chief telling me, he says, you don't know who's attacking you? I go, no, please tell us. He says, it's the former Army folks that you kicked out of, they don't have jobs anymore. It's not regime hardliners. These are folks that wanted to be on your side and are now frustrated that they're not. Now, of course, given those circumstances, Al-Qaeda moved in, other organizations moved in, and they took advantage of this fertile ground for insurgency. And all these disgruntled folks that wanted to just get back at the occupying force and wanted to reestablish some kind of Iraqi control of the government. We also had extreme haste in rotating forces out of theater per the plan. We'd defeat them and then we'd rotate forces out without regard to the changing conditions on the ground. I know for a fact Jay Garner went to the coalition and said, you can't rotate your forces out. I need those forces to maintain security and control while we get the Iraqi government stood up and get their forces able to do that. And the answer was, hey, we got our marching orders, we're going home. We also did a poor job of placement of forces in that transition, forces and capabilities. For example, in Baghdad, we took the 1st Infantry Division, the 3rd Infantry Division, that had gone in and was now occupying Baghdad. They were rotating out because they had accomplished their mission. And coming in was the 1st Armored Division. Now, while we were in Baghdad in those early months, we had elements of the 82nd Airborne Division working in primarily the south part of the city. Now, for those of you that may or may not understand, mechanized forces are in big armored vehicles, whether they're tanks or Bradleys or whatnot. And you're in an urban environment, and if you're in an big armored vehicle, your tendency is to use that armored vehicle as a big pillbox. And you're gonna take positions on street corners, or you're gonna move down the street with your turret moving back and forth. And you're looking out. Now, Iraqi people are not going to approach a big armored vehicle and tell you anything about what's going on in the local area. Now, in the sector that the 82nd was working, the 82nd is light infantry. They didn't have big armored vehicles. So they were on foot patrols. And the areas that they controlled were the most peaceful areas that we had, because they had on-the-spot knowledge of what was going on. They cultivated, it's like the cop on the beat, they were cultivating the local populace who saw them as more of protectors and people they could talk to, and they would inform them of what was going on if there were illicit activities going on. And they could take advantage of that. Well, we had the opportunity, and initially the thought was to put the 101st Airborne Division in Baghdad, which is, again, a light infantry division. And they would have been ideal, particularly because they were commanded by a brilliant leader, General David Petraeus. But because they had helicopters and were able to move quickly, the leadership decided to move them up to Mosul, where they could get them quickly without having to go around and take Mosul, and they would move the 1st Armored Division into Baghdad. So now we've got another big armored division in Baghdad, in an urban environment where you really need people on foot patrols. Now, I had civil affairs units all over the country. And I remember the first time I went up to Mosul and met with General Petraeus and got briefed by his staff. And I was just overwhelmed. They got it. I mean, every one of their combat leaders understood that they had to engage the populace, they had to protect the populace. General Petraeus would ask them every day, what have you done for the Iraqi people today? They weren't all about killing bad guys. They understood that in order to win this thing, and the civil affairs teams that I had up there were well integrated into that whole scheme. It was so refreshing. And then you come back, and I come back to Baghdad, or I go to other locations in Iraq, and the combat commanders were, they were dead set on, we're here to kill bad guys. And we're going to knock down doors, and we're going to go after them, which is all part of it. It's got to be done, but without regard to the safety and security of the local populace. The other blunder was that there was resistance by the military to support CPA efforts. There was no clear distinction or command relationship between the civilian organization, CPA, and the military organization. And I can tell you that the division commander on the ground in Baghdad and Jerry Brummer, it was like they hated each other. And they hated to work with each other. They didn't want to cooperate. And so you've got the military working one campaign, you got this interagency organization trying to work another, and they're not working in cooperation or synchronization. It was maddening to be there at the time. We made many of the similar mistakes in Afghanistan, but the biggest blunder was thinking we could oust Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and then focus the bulk of our efforts on regime change in Iraq. We failed to recognize the probability of Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces using insurgent tactics to regain their foothold in Afghanistan. Additionally, Afghanistan had huge difficulties not present in Iraq. Afghanistan had never had a strong central government or particularly strong national identity. Governmental corruption was and still is rampant. The populace relied on warlords and tribal affiliations to provide basic services, security, and the rule of law. The country is large, with few road networks, and often impassable terrain. Also, Afghanistan has a predominantly illiterate and uneducated population. These factors all made Afghanistan a prime location for insurgent activities, just as it had made it a great place for the Taliban to rule and for Al-Qaeda to find safe haven. Yet we seemed surprised when insurgency loomed in Afghanistan while we had our eye off the ball. The good news is that the U.S. military, especially the Army and Marine Corps, learned from our initial failures, gathered the lessons learned, and initiated an interagency collaboration that resulted in FM 3-24 counterinsurgency field manual that has served as a much-needed guide for our conduct of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2007 on. We are successfully drawing down in Iraq, although there is still great concern whether the Iraqi government and its security forces, both military and police, are fully up to the task of eliminating the numerous societal, economic, ethnic, and religious issues that have fueled the insurgency. In Afghanistan, we continue to make progress, though with much effort and expenditure of resources, and predominantly in those geographical regions where we are present and in control. The coalition is working better than ever. Our interagency partners are much better integrated into the overall effort and planning. Our ground forces have embraced counterinsurgency tactics, and their gains reinforced, and the gains that they've made reinforce the use of these tactics, techniques, and procedures. We utilize specialized teams to further our ends, things that we never imagined before the war, and before we were faced with counterinsurgency operations. Everything from agricultural teams to female engagement teams. We are undergoing a massive education program for the Afghan security forces as part of improving their competence and capability to be trained on military organizational skills, advanced weapon systems, and logistics. Nevertheless, we still have areas needing improvement. These include the need for more interagency resources, especially trained and experienced members of their agency, not just contracted personnel on temporary assignment for the agency. We also need to continue to improve our intelligence system and create a truly holistic and synchronized approach to information operations and psychological operations. Finally, Afghanistan needs a strong national government and far less corruption. It also needs a neighbor in Pakistan that is supportive. It's a supportive regional partner with vested interests in a stable Afghanistan. These are needs that may, frankly, prove too hard to achieve. Additionally, if we are ultimately to succeed in Afghanistan, we need a long-term commitment by both our government and the governments of our coalition partners. This, again, may be an elusive goal that could jeopardize our hard-won gains and ultimately the overall success of the mission. This, in my opinion, is the crux of the discussion concerning counterinsurgency operations. They are extremely difficult and costly enterprises that usually take a long time to win. We, as a nation, when given the choice, must decide before engaging in a counterinsurgency whether we have the political will to see it through to a successful conclusion. Unfortunately, we will not usually have that choice. We will not have the choice whether to engage in counterinsurgency. Inevitably, our opponents will foist an insurgency upon us in the numerous regions where we have vital national interests. Thus, we in the military must be prepared to adapt to and capable of successfully engaging in any variant of insurgency warfare. With that, I'll stop and turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
The first thing is, I think maybe, although I agree with you, we're going to face a lot of sub-conventional conflicts. Maybe we tend to look at military organization as a conflict between conventional and coin, and I think maybe that's a little bit artificial. The well-known statement of General George Decker, who was Chief of Staff under John F. Kennedy, when SOCOM was being set up, Special Operations at Fort Bragg, he says, any good soldier can handle guerrillas. And I think Smith said even the second-rate general can handle Vietnam if you get the politics right? And I think that's the important point that you made tonight, is that the political situation's it's got to be right. I mean, you can have the best soldiers in the world, they can do marvelous things, but if you are put into a bad political situation, there's very little that even good tactics can do to rescue that. And, I'm thinking Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, okay, say we put a really good coin team in there. Would it have really made any difference? I mean, sure, we could have avoided some mistakes, but in the end, would we have gotten a very different outcome in the long run? I mean, I'm just throwing this out as a question, for our discussion, because I think what happens is when you kick over an ant hill, ants start swarming, and you can try to control it, and you can have very good mechanisms to control it, but you've still got an anthill, and you're going to have Sunni-Shia conflicts. How you're going to resolve that? I mean, the Turks and the British always resolve it by simply giving power to the minorities. Now, that's going to be very difficult to do when we go in, because we're so democratizing it. Another thing you pointed out is this dilemma of, are we here to modernize these societies, or are we going to put them back the way they were because they were stable? In other words, how much do you respect the culture, and how much do you try to change it? And that's a dilemma going back to the 19th century. When the French or the British, and I know David's writing a book about this, when you move into a country, you leave the tribal structure as it is, or you try to modernize it. Send everybody to university, teach them how to be, sort of Western values of civilization. And so I think that's an old dilemma. And then another dilemma that you point out is that what is the limits of soldiering? I mean, we see a lot of soldiers here. We're going to teach them to be agricultural experts. I mean, is this their job? I mean, are we going to be tending victory gardens out in Fort Jackson? Female engagement teams. I teach a course in stability reconstruction. I had a young Army major, female, West Point graduate, who worked with the Marines, and she gave a lecture to my class. I mean, it was absolutely heartrending, to see the conditions these Afghan women live in. I mean, she showed pictures of 25-year-old women with, 10 kids. They look like they were 50. And, never seen a doctor and all this. And, of course, it's horrible, but is this what soldiers should be doing? I mean, I'm just asking the question, should we be engaged in social work? And this is one of the things I think that Andy Bracevich has pointed out. I mean, what are the limits of military professionalism? And I guess, what I would come to, if I had to show my hand, I would say, well, I agree with Decker. I think good soldiers learn good soldiering. And if you learn how to be a good soldier, you can handle things up and down the whole spectrum of conflict. I mean, that's my opinion, and I'm not a professional soldier. I actually was a graduate of this institution a long time ago. And I think, it's easier for people who are trained in conventional warfare, and I hope you're right. I hope we don't see conventional warfare again. People said we would see it again in 1919. We didn't think we'd see it again after 1945, and we didn't. And one reason we didn't see it is because the conventional forces were good. And that served as a deterrent, and we got these sub-war conflicts. Did the conventional soldiers handle them particularly well? I think in many cases they did. In the Philippines, David can talk a lot about the British conflicts, Malaya, for instance, Kenya. They've got some problems the way they handled it, but I think they handled it pretty well. I think when you look at the British forces, where they don't handle things very well, is when you take their coin army and you sort of up-armor them in World War II or World War I, and they don't do very well. Because they're not used to handling multi-armed formations, and they don't know how to coordinate things because they've been out, sort of beating Indians over the head, So I don't think that's really good training and a good deterrent. Again, I'm expressing my opinion. And you've pointed out, I think, several things, and I'm going to conclude here, which are really very important, that I think that this has been an experience that has lessened our appetite for doing future coin operations. They're extremely expensive. What are we now, after killing bin Laden, we've got, like 56 or 59% of the American population saying, okay, that's it. Let's get out of Afghanistan. We've done it. That's about where de Gaulle was in 1958 when he took over Algeria. I think, people see, I think we spent $4 trillion now. We've got budget problems. People are saying, hey, those are my schools. Those are my roads. Should we be doing this sort of thing? So I think we're going to see the downside of coin for that reason, because these sort of facile formulas, and I'm not blaming the military for this. I think you put the blame right where it belongs. The idea is that everybody loves us. All we got to do is go in and liberate these people. They'll throw flowers, and everything will fall into place. It doesn't work out that way. So the danger, I think, of coin is that it seems to present a formula. The potential danger is it seems to present a formula for making that work, when in fact the problems are much more systemic. I'll stop there.
The option of, no, we aren't trained this way. In fact, we'd be very bad at it. Doesn't actually seem to prevent them from occurring. And so my position for most of the last decade has been the only alternative is to change the training and doctrine such that we in fact do have a fighting force that's not only well trained, but well educated enough to appreciate the complexity and the diversity of these kinds of conflicts. I wish it were true that good soldiering was good enough in counterinsurgency campaigns. Good soldiering is really important in counterinsurgency campaigns. There's no way you can pull off the complex civil military operations and interagency discussions that are required. But there's also no way that massive overwhelming force solves the counterinsurgency problem. If that were the case, we wouldn't have had the problems we had in Iraq in 2005 and 2006. We would have been able to deal with things in the Korangal Valley once enough troops got there. And I think that the not history in the long form, but history in the near term really belies the fact that good soldiering, good marining, if that's a word, is in fact sufficient to win these kinds of conflicts. But more generally, and sort of a wave-top set of comments. We've got a very diverse audience, and what are some thoughts that I could leave a variety of individuals with? I think I have three major points. First is to watch The Wire. Second is to read Moneyball. And the third is to study these wars. So why do I say you should watch The Wire? Who's seen the HBO series The Wire? Oh, that's so disheartening. You guys need to watch The Wire, okay? So The Wire is about drug gangs in Baltimore, which may not sound very appetizing to most of y'all. It's really about intelligence and understanding threats and counter-threats in denied areas and amongst communities that are quite apart from the local government structures. It's also about institutions and the systematic failure of institutions within communities. The first season is about the Baltimore police. The second season is about Baltimore dock workers unions. Third season is about City Hall. Fourth season is about public schools. Right? This is deeply about governance and conflict-affected communities. It's brilliantly written, and it makes the difficult things, the foreign things about Iraq or Afghanistan or the Philippines, the Horn of Africa, very concrete and very real. And it's really, really funny. I used to tell my Marines, I used to teach at the Marine Command Staff College, I would tell my Marines to watch The Sopranos, which was pretty good, at the time. It gets at a lot of the application of political violence, if you will. But The Wire really captures the fundamental nature of the kinds of conflicts that we find ourselves in today. And even if we don't have formalized counterinsurgencies such as we've seen in the last 10 years, we're going to have some form of bizarre, criminal, irregular conflict. The Wire captures a lot of it. The second piece of advice is to read Moneyball. Who has read Moneyball or maybe seen the recent movie? We've got like 3 baseball fans in the audience. You guys are a tough crowd. Moneyball is about abstract, bizarre statistics in baseball, which in fact have a lot of relevance to abstract, bizarre statistics in counterinsurgency campaigns. We'd like to have a FIBA, right? We'd like to have a line of advance that moves toward Berlin, and when it hits Berlin, we know we've won. Just like we'd like batting average to tell us all we want to know about who to draft in our fantasy leagues. It turns out both are bad indicators in a modern context. You need to think more critically about what is the pieces of information that really characterize the key questions you have at hand, right? What are those critical information requirements? What are those priority information requirements that are not traditional requirements of your intelligence job? So when I was an advisor in Afghanistan, I say the one piece of information I wish I had in RC South and Southwest, I wanted to know which district governors slept in the district center at night and how often they did so. I never met a single shop in the country that was collecting that piece of information, right? Critical, basic, I don't need national level assets in order to pick that up. I don't need to task something from NGA or NSA in order to find that out. I just want to know if that district governor shows up in the district center and if he sleeps there at night. That's one piece of Moneyball. The other piece of Moneyball is it's about organizational change. The story of Moneyball in Major League Baseball is sort of a different approach, telling the scouts that they don't know what they're talking about, telling people that 5-tool players with good face don't in fact make good baseball players over the long term. It's very similar to the story of counterinsurgency in the United States Army and the Department of Defense over the last decade. It's a story of do my statistics, do my theories, explain the phenomenon that I have before me, and if not, what do I do about it? Is there another approach that helps explain what it is we're seeing? Is there another approach that would make me more successful? And Moneyball is the story of organizational change. It's got a great, nearly tragic hero in the Oakland A's manager, Billy Beane. A lot of Red Sox stuff, and I spent a lot of time in Boston, so there's some nice pieces of that. If you're a Yankees fan, you may not like it as much. If you're a AL West person, you may not like it much either. But Moneyball is, again, one of these counterintuitive pieces that really captures a way of thinking, a counterintuitive approach to a really complex set of problems. And the final piece is to study these wars. Historians do a fantastic amount of work, and I would not have been able to write my dissertation without actually the works of Professor Portier or a lot of the other historians who have studied insurgencies over the last 50 or 100 years. But we have an incredible amount of rich information coming out of these particular wars. Books by Antonio Giustosi, we have the privilege of working with at CARIS, but also military commanders, Chris Kalenda, Chris Cavoli, Joe Latwell, Dale Alford, folks from Afghanistan and Iraq who can have sufficient education and sufficient presence of mind to be able to translate between very high-level academic concepts and very hard-nosed operational principles. These are folks who put some very difficult ideas into practice and paid a very heavy price in a lot of instances, but are part of the sort of living history of these wars. There's also a lot of theories, sort of assumptions about these wars that we really haven't tested. We've talked a lot about the provision of jobs and electricity in reducing insurgency. I frankly have no great idea whether or not spending a lot of CERT money works. Does it reduce the number of insurgent recruits? Does it reduce violence in a fundamental way? It's very difficult to test. We don't have great evidence for that. What is the role of popular militias? What was the actual recruitment mechanism, the individual mentalities, the tribal dynamics that went into Sons of Iraq? To what degree is that applicable to Afghanistan? It's a VSO program, the Village Stability Operations Program that the Special Forces folks have been working on. Is that going to create a stabilizing counterweight and provide local security, like the rondas in Peru? Or is it going to provide another privatized security mechanism like in Colombia? There are some really detailed field work, but also interviews that can be done amongst the military community and other government agencies that have been working there, not all of which is classified, that we still have, there's fundamental mechanisms about political violence and the role of populations in these campaigns that we really don't fully understand. So that's it. Watch The Wire, read Moneyball, study these wars.
I want to come back to this idea of whether good soldiering is enough for counterinsurgency, and I think we also have to take one step back and ask, what is soldiering? I did my PhD on the US military's, or the US military and its institutional learning of counterinsurgency, and it struck me that the US military had one particular definition of soldiering, and other militaries have other definitions. And I know I sound British. I should just be full disclosure, I'm actually Swedish. We haven't done counterinsurgency for centuries, so I have no dog in this fight, but I just thought it was an interesting case study to look at. So I did my PhD on the extent to which the US could move from this very conventional understanding of war, which came into Iraq with it, and then move to an understanding of counterinsurgency and ability to train and prepare soldiers to do those sorts of things. And my findings, insofar as I can bring them all together and synthesize them for you, were that in terms of doctrine, education, and training, there were some impressive results. I mean, I think the US military, particularly the Army and Marine Corps, should be commended for the swift adaptation in some of these areas. But again, sticking on to the institutional level, it was clear that whereas certain units on the ground were adapting very swiftly, and of course, Major General Blackledge mentioned General Petraeus and Mosul. On the institutional level, what I found was that achieving change in terms of force structure or resource allocation was far more difficult, and oftentimes priorities that were inherited from the 1990s prevailed, assumptions inherited from the 1990s prevailed, and institutional change, therefore, came very slowly. Now, I did my PhD some years ago, but I bring this up because at this point, one of the most disconcerting facets of the conversation about counterinsurgency is that I feel that as we draw down from Afghanistan, counterinsurgency is unfortunately on its way out. Afghanistan, more than Iraq, has been a highly gruesome experience for everyone involved, and as other panelists mentioned, there's been zero appetite to repeat anything like that. And of course, we also face a completely different fiscal reality today than we've done in the last 10 years. Basically, even if it's workable, the idea of going into societies abroad, trying to change them predominantly by military means into something more hospitable or positive to our interests is simply a non-starter given the financial environment in which we're operating. So we return to this idea that we're not going to do this anymore. And it's not the first time, of course, that we've seen that. Also, post-Vietnam, this idea that we're not going to do this anymore. Now, I'm very sympathetic to that course. I don't think anyone in their right mind would want to do counterinsurgency. It's possibly one of the more complex forms of warfare that you can imagine. So that's a good idea. Let's not do this anymore then. The problem is, of course, what then are you going to do? And it's then that we get to this very problematic bifurcation that dominates virtually all the military thinking, not just in the US, but also in Europe. This idea between conventional warfare and irregular warfare. It's a bifurcation that encourages an idea that even though we like to separate these things in theory, they also exist as separate, rarefied entities out there in the wider world. And of course, if you have that choice between counterinsurgency or regular warfare on the one hand and conventional warfare on the other, it's logical for any army, particularly given the way we train and prepare, to say, well, let's just do the conventional stuff. That's what we like to do. Why on earth do you want to do this stuff again? This is difficult. Let's go back to Desert Storm, 1991. That's what we want to do. Well, the problem with that choice, of course, is that insurgency is unfortunately here to stay. And I don't mean that we're going to do another Afghanistan, another Iraq anytime soon. I sincerely doubt that. This is not going to be counterinsurgency per se. The problem is that if you look at the likely characteristics of warfare in the coming, say, 30, 40, 50 years, or even further along, I mean, this is historically consistent, you're going to see the same characteristics and the same challenges as we've encountered both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think that you look at a global trend of urbanization. More and more people are living in cities and towns, built-up areas. This means that whenever you send a Marines or the Army off to some foreign country, they're very likely to be operating in urban environments. And what does that mean? Well, that means that they'll be operating among civilian populations. And because of the nature of expeditionary operations, you're doing it somewhere abroad, it also means that they're likely to operate in a foreign language, in a foreign culture, in a foreign environment. We need to get up to speed very quickly as to how things work. Now, what else can we predict with some level of certainty about the future of armed conflict, particularly armed conflict conducted by land forces? Well, most wars are conducted in areas of weak states. Now, there are two reasons for this at least. Either the invasion itself produced the weakness, think of Iraq, for example, 2003, or the weakness itself is the cause of the invasion. Here we look at Afghanistan in 2001. Those are two general reasons why we go to war. So, if we're talking about operating in weak states, what does that mean? What implications does that have? Well, it's weak formal structures. So you have informal networks of sub-state patronage, influence, and power that the soldier must understand and be able to engage with very quickly. You have usually, because of the high levels of insecurity, proliferation of small arms. That means there's a very insecure environment. How's that going to work out? What are you going to do about that? And of course, because the state is very weak, we also have sub-state politics. So again, we come back to the comments made previously about tribal allegiances and again, informal networks. So you can see how, even though you're not going to be deployed maybe on a counterinsurgency operation, on a new sort of 10-year campaign to state build in some godforsaken part of the planet, it's very likely that the same type of challenges are going to rear their head, and they have to be dealt with. So the way I look at this is maybe the most promising way forward, given the almost what I see as the very high probability, let's put it that way instead, of facing these types of challenges on the one hand, but also the very high probability of counterinsurgency basically being pushed off the table in the coming 5 years. How are we going to proceed? Well, my personal recommendation is that we start talking more earnestly about war and what war truly means. Every time that the United States military has had to deal with insurgency of some sort, we introduce this new bifurcation, a new dichotomy. In the 1960s, it was limited war versus general war. In the 1980s, there was low-intensity conflict versus high or mid-intensity conflict. In the 1990s, most awkwardly, it was war versus military operations other than war, abbreviated MUTWA. And even today, while doctrine, if you read official Army doctrine, it actually dismisses all this stuff and talks about a continuum of operations. But go anywhere, whether it's National Defense University where I work, or Pentagon, or anywhere, and you will hear talk of irregular warfare versus, I guess, regular warfare, or asymmetric adversaries, as if there are adversaries out there who prefer to fight symmetrically. It's just something that's deeply entrenched in our minds and understanding of war, but it's so unhelpful because it encourages this belief that we can pick and choose as to what side of the spectrum we're going to engage at. Frank Hoffman, a colleague of mine at the National Defense University, champions the notion of hybrid wars, wars that combine the most challenging aspects from across the spectrum of operations. That's one way of looking at it. But I think equally so, we could just speak about war. How have wars always been? I mean, the whole idea of conventional campaigns really blind to the history from which it borrows. We have the 1991 campaign in Iraq. It's basically one case for. But even if you look at the Second World War, what would the Second World War have been if we didn't have a period of stabilization, state building, or reconstruction in Germany and Japan? When we look at Panama, again, the forgotten aspect of Panama is, of course, the post-conflict stabilization, following capture of Noriega, mass looting, mass criminality, very similar in some ways to what happened after Iraq in 2003. So maybe the way to think about our reality, to prepare for it, and to foster the type of institutional change that I try to trace in my PhD research is to just reconceive war as something based not on this artificial applications, but on the most likely challenges that we're going to see. Thank you.
To be honest, I was frankly disappointed. There had been two State Department folks on the staff there at the Joint Task Force on Africa. When I got there, and I'd gotten the bios and everything, and I was expecting to meet with one of them in particular, and was told that that individual is no longer on the staff. They've left. But I don't know what the details were on that. When I attended the briefing, the operations briefing that the Admiral gave to me, and he had all his staff there, the other State Department person was not even sitting at the table. She was sitting back behind the Admiral, didn't give a presentation as everybody around the table. When we kind of opened it up, she did ask a question of me, but I kind of inquired afterwards and realized that for whatever reason, she'd kind of been marginalized, and I don't know whether that was because of her performance or the way that the operation was being run, but it was clearly a predominantly military operation. I mean, I walked in there, and I could have been walking into Baghdad or Afghanistan. And so I was disappointed to see that, okay, somehow when it gets down to the tactical and operational level, there's not as much interagency involvement and impact as I was hoping to see. Now, when I went around to the different countries that we're in, and there was more involvement by the country teams, the embassy team with my folks that were working on the ground. But as far as the whole Joint Task Force and the effort, there wasn't that much impact. I don't know how much of that is being translated at the COCOM level for AFRICOM, where that stands and what that is. But I think it's a very much needed concept, and again, I don't know whether part of the problem that we've got with our interagency partners is that they really are not operational, and that they're not staffed to be operational, they're not trained to be operational. And the unfortunate thing is the military is very operational. I mean, we are great at planning. The State Department doesn't do planning. And what often happens, in my perspective, is that we try to put these staffs together, like these interagency staffs together, and the civilian partners just kind of get overrun by all the military folks who are hard charging and know how to do this stuff, and don't take the effort to encourage the input from the interagency, and the interagency folks sometimes are reluctant or to do that, or we're just kind of overwhelmed on what's all going on, and this is totally foreign to their nature. And it's so we really need to build that into our interagency organizations. I mean, it was a revelation to me when I talked to people that were working at CPA in Iraq, and I said, hey, this must be somebody there from Treasury, and I said, hey, this must be great for your career to have this kind of operational assignment, and say, no, actually, this is detrimental to my career because I'm being taken out of the mainstream, and my partners in Department of Treasury are moving up the career ladder, and they kind of see this as a side issue that taking me out of, and it was just, gosh, it's just such a foreign concept, and I'm probably over answering that question.
Colonel Bullen, you had a question.
Honestly, I am not the best person to answer that question. I don't think that I can provide an answer that would be worth your time listening to, so I'll gladly hand over to General.
Well, I'll have a go. I mean, again, I don't think civil affairs is the province of special operations. I think special operations does something else. I mean, I think they carry out special operations. Soldiers and a whole government approach, that's the mechanism to do counterinsurgency / nation building, parts of nation building that apply to that. I mean, I see personally special ops guys, kicking in doors and, jumping out of planes. I mean, I think that's basically what they like to do. And, we've sort of alluded to this. I mean, there's a lot of turf battles that go on in the military. I mean, this whole discussion we were having earlier about conventional versus counterinsurgency or coin. I mean, this goes back to the 19th century. This is Winfield Scott and Emory Upton saying these Indian fighters are unprofessional. They're killing people. And, we've really got to go out and professionalize and moralize the military. And coin is really not a professional military activity. Well, sorry, they wouldn't use the word coin. Indian fighting they would have used. And then this becomes small wars, as it was called. And so you have these huge debates that go on in the 19th into the 20th century between the small warriors and the big warriors. And this becomes conventional coin. And everybody's fighting for their piece of the pie and who's going to control the trade-off. Because if you grab trade-off, you've got the military. So, I mean, these are institutional disputes that are certainly there, and you referred to them.
This is a great question, and I mean it sounds so simple because we've been doing it right for the last 10 years. Unfortunately, when you think about what counterinsurgency really is, there's a big dearth of definitions. There's one military definition which runs something along the lines of all political, economic, social, military, ideological, informational means taken to counterinsurgency, which is great because of course that's very inclusive. But it's so inclusive it just fails to exclude anything. For that very reason, it's completely meaningless. It doesn't give us anything to go on. So instead, rather than actually thinking of a definition of counterinsurgency, which of course is impossible to define because it's completely contingent on the nature of an insurgency, instead of defining it, we tend to understand counterinsurgency by its practices, by how it's conducted in the field. So we look at Afghanistan and we say, that's counterinsurgency. We look at Iraq and say, that's counterinsurgency. But that's wholly unsatisfactory because practice changes over time. Practice changes by geography, by unit. So in a sense, many conversations about counterinsurgency don't even resolve a very semantic but also meaningful point, and we therefore end up speaking past each other. So one unit comes back and can make counterinsurgency and talk on that basis, whereas someone academic in Ivory Tower that has studied history has a completely different understanding of counterinsurgency. And never do we sit down and actually define our terms. I've been to countless conferences where basically counterinsurgency is bandied about without definition, and we basically hope that we all mean the same thing. But in fact, it's just too boring and tedious to make sure that that's the case. It's a problem. It's a problem with the discussion as a whole, and I think it reinforces my point that I made previously, that in the future, I think we're better off straying far off this divisive and very semantically ambiguous term and talk about war as it manifests itself instead.
Professor Simpson, you'd like to take a shot at that?
So there's always two ways to answer definition questions. One is to say that there is no proper useful definition. The other is to ask you to define another term. So the question then becomes, what is an insurgency? Okay. So the FM 324 has this definition with lots of adjectives but no verbs. There's no so much to do about an insurgency. The real question is, how do you know which field manual you're supposed to pick up? Am I supposed to be doing foreign internal defense? Am I supposed to be doing 3-08 stab ops? Am I doing counterinsurgency? What is it that I'm supposed to be doing, and how do I know what that is? So one way you recognize counterinsurgency is by operations in the field. The other is by characterizing the nature of the adversary. And so I would say that counterinsurgency depends on an adversary that's organized in such a manner to employ violence for the overthrow or capture of a central government. You then start characterizing their activities by what we're used to seeing in the field. You'll have everything ranging from guerrilla warfare to potentially political terrorism, intimidation against the population, but also competing governance structures, shadow governments, influence campaigns, competing development and infrastructure projects, all the things that sort of make counterinsurgency and exercise in competitive governance, not just about the warfare component. That's from my dissertation perspective, that's really what I focused on was coherent organizations that were advocating a competing platform of governance and use of violence to achieve it.
You might want to add one popular culture to your reference to your list. If you throw out the romantic mush, the debate within the movie The Patriot over how to deal with the insurgency in South Carolina, part of it's made up, but do we go hearts and minds, or do we put the boot?
Right. I mean, that's we do a piece of the course. There's a program within the DoD called Afghans, which trains individuals for continual tours in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We do part of their counterinsurgency training for that. And we actually spend a good portion of the course talking about hearts and minds, which I think is probably one of the, it's actually beyond a useless concept, it's actually a destructive concept, in that you don't win these wars by making people like you, because there's somebody else coming in at night killing their siblings and their parents. Right? You win wars by protecting people and killing bad people. And figuring out how to do that is part of getting close enough to the population so that they tell you who the bad guys are instead of telling the bad guys who you are. And that's where the real sort of dynamics, from my perspective, of protecting the population come in. We're not protecting the population because it's nice or it feels good or we think it's the right thing to do. All of those things are nice benefits, good for morale, good for motivating soldiers, Marines, but aren't about winning wars. Right? You protect the population because the population has the intelligence needed to find and kill.
But hearts and minds is a PR term. I mean, it's a PR term. It's invented in the 1890s to really disguise what's actually going on in counterinsurgency, which is a lot of really nasty stuff. And one of the problems now, and the general alluded to it, is that, I mean, you can't practice classic counterinsurgency now, like the British did in Malaya and Kenya, because you're not in a media vacuum. Everybody's looking at you. And you cannot put, 1 million Kenyans in concentration camps. I mean, you cannot deport Chinese from Malaya to Chiang Kai-shek where he kills them on the docks. I mean, you can't get away with that today. So these terms were intentionally developed at the very time that Kitchener was doing this in South Africa, that Whaler was doing it in Cuba, which really helps to get us involved. The French had the same thing going on. They called it peaceful penetration. Show force so we won't have to use it. Boy, were they ever using it. Oil spot. All of this is sort of anodyne terminology to cover really a lot of nastiness that's going on and sell it as a sort of PR product.
I think one of the things that to point out is that, and we both hit on a really important piece, is that when we're doing what may be referred to as hearts and minds work, you used the term earlier when you were talking about the female engagement team, like social welfare or something.
Yeah, probably whatever came around.
Yeah. The intent there is, there's a military intent. It's to help us root out and destroy the bad guys. Now, many times, even the soldiers that are doing the efforts, it's very easy to get carried away with the humanitarian aspect of what you're doing. But an example would be the female engagement teams. I mean, what we know is that, particularly in the suppressed societies, if we can empower the women in that society, it will make a huge difference in countering the insurgency because the women are the ones that maintain the family unit. They're the ones that have the interest in maintaining that, and that if it's not to their benefit to have they're the man of the house out fighting, and you can empower them to realize that hey, they can help improve their living condition themselves. That's all great work that has a huge impact. I mean, it's been proven in societies where the women can get educated and be powerful are not the societies that we're having the problems in general. So
But those teams are actually born of 2 Marine intelligence officers. Their humanitarian intent is, again, commendable, but I know the 2 Marine captains who put it together. They were hoping to have a pretty specific intelligence benefit to those teams, not just the social. You call it social welfare when it's engagement team. That's what all civil affairs teams in Iraq is primarily doing.
But the problem is that these women aren't trained to gather intelligence. What they're taking anybody who's a woman, where she's driving a truck or whatever, and they're taking them in to do these work.
Distinction amongst the services on how that selection process goes.
But, well, because they don't have that many women in Afghanistan, so they've got to use what they got. I mean, this was what the woman told us, this major. She was saying, I was using anybody, and I wasn't getting any intelligence. I agree with you, absolutely. That's the goal. That's what Hearts and Minds is about. That's why the French would build markets in these towns. And they would say, oh, we want to get everybody in. And then we figure out who's there, and then we start interrogating them. And it's not to improve the life of the people, it's to get intelligence. And that was the whole goal of these things. So, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's what's behind it. It's not the social welfare.
just to comment on, I know Tom didn't really get an answer on the question about civil affairs and special operations. But my concern is that we haven't moved civil affairs out of special operations. We still have an active duty brigade in special operations. We have the bulk of the force. 94% of the force supports GPF. And so we've taken a small force that we don't have enough of and that we're growing, and we've split it. So, okay, you guys only help special operations forces, and the rest of you help general purpose forces, but the doctrine and component is still in special operations, so we're not getting the doctrine and the types of component efforts that need to be focused on the whole force, particularly the bulk of the force that supports general purpose forces doing their job. And so that's the issue that's been created because that's been split. I've been saying all along, we're too small of a force to split us. I don't care whether we're special operations or non-special operations, we need to be together. Because when we're doing civil affairs, we're doing civil affairs. It just depends on who the customer is and how we get to work. So that's another point I was going to make there for the process.
I think that the special operations community, especially, the White Soft community, the SF, USSF in particular,
Regional salt.
Whichever.
Black and white salt cover for status, now, so it's regional salt and national salt.
Can make a very constructive PR argument for the cost-saving approach that they've long embodied, right? Foreign internal defense, security force assistance, even, UW are vastly more economical than sending 100,000 GPF to your least favorite country on the planet at the time, right? So we've really moved away from a lot of that more nuanced approach. Even in the Cold War, we have some large theaters of operations, of course, but right next door to Vietnam, we have operations in Cambodia and Thailand. There's just mags in Thailand and Philippines that persist really to this day. These are a lot of the more nuanced solutions to variety of threats, whether hybrid or otherwise, that we've sort of taken out of our kit bag. We've sort of forgotten that there are a solution other than invading a foreign country. I think SOCOM is going to be okay in the budget fight for a variety of reasons, both because of the direct action component, but I think there are still some good advocates of the indirect component that still, I hope, are able to be persist. I do think there's actually a great study to be done, whether through the Naval Postgraduate School or Civilian Academy, on the organizational history, even just the last decade, of Special Forces. Understanding of a core mission, moving away, being pulled away from that core mission, whether willingly or not, and there's some good debate on that. And then in Afghanistan in particular, a sort of return to a much more classic FID mission under SOSOC Alpha the last couple of years. But it's been a difficult fight. I mean, there was definitely a lot of attraction to the direct action side of things. And that has some real challenges for the core competency, but also the institutional memory that particular group.
Just to follow up on those very same comments, and this gives me an opportunity to plug my book. My book's called The New Counterinsurgency Era, and for geeks like myself, it's sort of a play on a previous book that was written by Douglas Blackledge that's called The Counterinsurgency Era. The reason I bring this up is that there have been, to my count, at least 3 post-World War II counterinsurgency eras in the US military in the 1960s and 1980s, and since the invasion of Iraq. And what I found through my research is that in each one of these cycles, beginning with the first 2, there was an attempt to turn both the Special Operations community or Special Forces community and the General Purpose Forces towards whatever it was called at the time, whether it was regular or limited or low intensity. But what quickly emerged was that it was quite difficult and quite unattractive to turn the General Purpose Forces into that direction. So what happened was you had this division of labor then, that this elite Special Forces units, or then the soft community, took care of the irregular stuff, whereas General Purpose Forces could go on and do their thing. Now, during the Cold War, of course, there was all sorts of rationale for doing that because there was always the threat of an armed advance across the Central Front. Today, while I agree with you completely that the indirect approach and the soft toolkit are indispensable for maintaining global influence in a very restricted physical environment, my concern is that we lose them. We think that we got it covered, and we think that we can let the General Purpose Forces basically go on or go back to as they were. And that is a problem to me because, as I tried to explain in my comments, I just don't think that the Army and Marine Corps in particular have the luxury of being able to opt out of some of the operational challenges that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, wherever they deploy. So I think that while we should definitely encourage an indirect approach and what the soft bring to the table, we also have to get General Purpose Forces reoriented towards these types of challenges. Not least, of course, because no matter how great they grow, there's only so much special operation forces you can have, and sometimes that just isn't enough, particularly when you look at partners. Yeah.
But can I just make a quick comment? I think, soft is going to do fine. It's going to do fine because it plays into the romanticism of the Army. It's the white, it's the white guy going out and organizing the natives to succeed in a way that they never could. It's the white Raj of Sarawak, it's Lawrence of Arabia, it's Chinese Gordon, it's the men who would be king, it's the Bureau Zahab, the Indian political service, it's the Green Berets. And I haven't seen the film Avatars, but apparently it's the same sort of thing. It's Tom Cruise, The Last Samurai. I mean, there's this plays very deeply, I think, into the Western psychology. And soft, it plays very much on that image. And I think it lures us into certain strategic mistakes or believing that certain things like security assistance are more valuable and less dangerous than they actually are. And to give to potential shortfalls or dangers of that. Either you get security assistance like we're seeing in Afghanistan, where we're training up a bunch of people who then go out and work for private contractors at our expense, or you're making the military too powerful in a state so that even the conservatives don't want it. I mean, in that, talking to my Latin American specialist friends who say that's really what brought a war to the end, to the end in El Salvador, is that U.S. security assistance made the Salvadoran army so powerful that even the conservatives got worried, and they wanted to have peace talks. It was sort of the conservatives who wanted to have peace. I know there were other factors, but that was certainly one.
That's my question.
I think one of the big problems that we've got is that there's political pressure because of the cultural norms within our own country that you talked about to define that end game and give a date to it. And it just plays into our enemy's hands, which has that long-term, multi-generational perspective on things, and it makes our allies in Afghanistan and Iraq nervous because, well, how much support am I going to give you because you're going to be gone next year, and then I'm going to be having to deal with these. So it creates a big dilemma because we culturally don't have that long-term perspective.
All right.
Well, just a comment over here. I want to emphasize something that was stated earlier, and that is that I really don't see this as a choice between counterinsurgency operations and mindset and conventional operations and mindset. What we need to do is expand our conventional mindset to include counterinsurgency tactics, techniques, and procedures, and the ability to adapt and learn that. One of the critiques I've heard from folks that argue that we've gone too far on the counterinsurgency route is that we are losing our tactical ability in combat arms. Our field artillery units are not proficient. Our tank units are not proficient in their basic combat skills, and that's true. It's not true because we focused on counterinsurgency. It's true because as a country we have overcommitted ourselves in two major theaters of war, and we are rotating forces so we have been. I mean, it's starting to improve now with the drawdown in Iraq, but the units they were spending a year in one country or the other, and then a year or less back before they went back in. They had no time to train on their basic combat skills because they were reorganizing and re-equipping to go back into theater to do counterinsurgency operations, so they were focused on the mission. Everybody, I mean, I'm an old field artilleryman. Everybody that I know in the Army is concerned about the loss of those combat skills because of the operational tempo that we've had. But that I have not ever heard anybody say, oh, we need to reduce the emphasis on those combat skills because it's really all about counterinsurgency. It's all about that broader spectrum, and we can't expect to not be in counterinsurgency operations.